Hello, everyone. I just finished The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Even though this book says The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which I've also read and reviewed before, but this was a combo book which had both stories inside. And I actually got this, I think, in a bookstore in Springfield, Missouri. And I think it's an old edition from the 1930s, I believe. But yes, I just finished the Old Curiosity Shop. It's always a little sad when I have to take the bookmark out that I've been using, but now I can use it on this book, which is a book called Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. But because I have been reading a lot of Dickens lately, because Dickens is Dickens is kind of like the comfort food of classic literature. He's difficult enough that it feels like I'm reading, difficult, challenging literature, but not so difficult that I have to struggle. And also, Dickens just immerses you in his world, and which is why I love reading him so much. I feel like I can relax with Dickens, and even with the most difficult passages in his work, I rarely have to reread a passage more than twice if it's difficult. Which is why I'm now taking a break from Dickens by reading something by Joseph Conrad because I want to savor Dickens as much as possible. I also want to be exposed to a variety of different writers, but for some reason, when I'm depressed, like I was reading Crime and Punishment, which I will get through eventually, but there was just something I just wasn't finding Crime and Punishment. There was something about it that just wasn't drawing me in, and then when depressing episode happened, I decided to go back to Dickens. Um, but even though The Old Curiosity Shop in some ways is a very depressing book, now I'll try to make this spoiler free, but well, but even though there are a lot of dramatic things that happen that I would like to talk about, but I think I can tell you the essence of it without necessarily spoiling anything. Well, it's about obviously the book is about this character named Little Nell. Even though she's not that little, she's only about 13 years old with her grandfather, and they run the Old Curiosity Shop. But even though the Old Curiosity Shop actually isn't in the book that much, it's really only at the beginning. And because again, Dickens originally was going to make it a short story, but then decided to extend it. And basically, the grandfather is has gambling debts, and especially he owes money to this man named Quilp, who's kind of who he's a dwarf. Quilp is a dwarf, and he's really diabolical and scheming, and he doesn't make dwarfs look very good. But of course, which I can see some people perhaps complaining about, but that's the way Dickens portrayed him. And anyway, and he has this wife who's not a dwarf, but who he abuses, and he somehow has designs on Little Nell, who's only 13. So he's a very diabolical character, sinister character, and he's probably the most unsympathetic character that I've read from Dickens so far. And well, because the grandfather can't pay the debts, Quilp takes over at the Old Curiosity Shop, and then the grandfather and Nell are left out in the street, and they're having to fend for themselves. And it's basically about the adventure that they go on along the way, and how they're trying to live off of people, the kindness of strangers, basically. And then of course you have the character of Kit, who was an assistant, a servant of the grandfather. But then when obviously when the grandfather and Little Nell fled, Kit didn't know what happened to them, and the story is really just as much about Kit as it is about Little Nell, and it's about how Kit is. And now this is the only spoiler that I reveal, but that I will reveal. So if you don't want to know this, then I would suggest maybe skipping to the 5 minute mark. And so there's a scene where Kit trusts this lawyer named Samson Brass and his sister Sally Brass, but then they end up framing him for for theft because Quilp doesn't like the fact that Kit doesn't like Kit, and because Kit threatened to beat him up, and therefore they try to frame him, and that storyline takes a large portion of the book. And now I will say though that one of the things that I find kind of strange about Dickens is that from what I've read so far, so and I've only the books that I've read by Dickens, I've read Great Expectations, I've read A Tale of Two Cities, Hard Times. I'm trying to remember all of them. Hard Times, Our Mutual Friend, and A Christmas Carol. I think so. This is my sixth Dickens book, and is that usually, from what I've read so far, older female characters usually aren't portrayed in a flattering manner. If they're like a lot of times, the good female characters are between the ages of like 15 and 20, and then the older ones are like the older ones who are more corrupt are usually 30 or above. And Dickens seemed to have I don't know, contempt for older females, and of course, if you've read about his life. That also seems to be the case, and that's something about him that I don't quite like. Of course, that doesn't mean that Sally Brass, who is kind of a despicable, it doesn't mean that she's not interesting. She is, but she's kind of a conniver, a schemer, and which is an interesting character. I just find it odd that older female characters usually aren't portrayed well. But probably the part that really touched my emotions in this book is towards the end when um, the book talks about death and how to react to death. In fact, if I can find it, I know I should have had this laid out ahead of time. I might show you. I might show you that the passage that I really thought. Oh, here it is. I was lucky to stumble upon it. This passage I really like. When death strikes down the innocent and young, for every fragile form from which he lets the parting spirit free, 100 virtues rise, in shapes of mercy, charity, and love, to walk the world and bless it. Of every tear that sorrowing mortals shed on such green graves, some good is born, some gentler nature comes. In the destroyer's steps there spring up bright creations that defy his power, and his dark path becomes a way of light to heaven. I just that passage really stuck with me, and whenever because I could really relate to it, and whenever I suffer loss in my life, then I may go back to that passage because it just sums up how we often feel when we lose loved ones so perfectly. And the book has a very tragic and melancholy ending, which I won't reveal, even though I knew part of it because it was revealed in a documentary before I even read this book. So I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I knew that what was going to befall some characters. And although I will admit that Dickens has a really cheeky way at the end, after all the tragedy of trying to sum everything up, that I found to be kind of corny, but in a way that I think is befitting of Dickens. And but even though the tones were a little not uneven, but I think he was trying to console people after the tragedy, so I understand why he did it. But overall, that is my review of the old Curiosity Shop, at the very least, without going into spoilers.